Hi, good afternoon. It's Dr. Michael McNeil here. Just had a lovely time in nature there, harvesting. We've got loads of mint and stuff in the garden, and I think 3 or 4 different types of mint and sage, and so it was just really nice. It's just starting to. This is actually being done just at the end of October, and we've had like a really nice, strong, a long, warm sort of. We call it autumn here. I think in some other places you call it fall. And although apparently I was hearing yesterday that's uninclusive language. You've got to call it something else because that's discriminatory for people that live in the southern hemisphere. Can you actually? That is a remarkable statement, isn't it? But anyway, let's move on quickly from that. So I think the interesting thing about working in the garden is a lot of people talk about how important it is to be grounded, and they're sort of like using like a pseudo-scientific description of, if you go out there with your bare feet and you feel the grass, you're discharging all the static electricity from your body, and which is a nice interesting bit of pseudoscience, but it's certainly a wonderful. It just helps you understand the importance of being in contact with the natural world and the aesthetic quality, which is something that philosophy needs to capture as well, and the importance of beauty and I can remember many years ago when I was young, probably only 17, 18, and I just left home, sort of under bad sort of circumstances, but I was involved in lots of radical left groups at that time, part of that period of my life. And I can remember I went to a conference, and I've always had that sort of like inclination. I always sort of like loved sort of being in nature and experiencing nature, and there was just something about my personality and the character that just seemed to be there. It was just something that seemed to sort of come out. And I can remember being in one of these conferences, and I was talking a bit about that and the importance of sort of the importance of nature and being in touch with nature. And one of the one of the leaders, one of the Marxist leaders, who was really seemed to take exception to that. And somebody else in the audience says, "I suffer from hay fever, and I would love if all the world was just covered over with concrete." And so that's why, if you want to know one of the reasons after the post-Second World War, when socialism in different countries, especially in Europe, really when it really became strong, there was all this sort of like building of, like things were always square or rectangular, and things were considered functional rather than aesthetic. And they just created these horrible concrete monstrosities, which even when I came to when I moved back to this area where I live now, there was still quite a lot of local sort of shopping centres which were from that era, and they were just made of concrete and were ugly, and they just oozed depression, and a major part of the restoration of the area would be the knocking down of these and their replacement with something that looked so much more aesthetically beautiful, and things weren't just all the same and functional, but they had a character about them. And that's one of the most valuable operations, I think, of philosophy, is to appreciate the importance of the aesthetic environment, and we mustn't fall prey to these very what are you calling it? What's that word called? Sort of it is reductionism in the sense of, but it's the it's not the sterilising of the environment, though it is the sterilising of the environment. The rarefying, that's it, I got to the word. The rarefying of human experience, which is something that's very popular in sort of like especially in radical left politics, is this sort of rarefying and its replacement with function and utility, and the importance of something being just functional rather than beautiful. Well, you want it functional, but you want it beautiful too. And so part of the importance of a philosopher, I suppose, and the discipline of philosophy, is to argue for that, to make a case for that, and how important the aesthetic is, and how beneficial the aesthetic is, how wonderful it is to be able to go out and sort of when it's beautiful like this. I've had to put a shade over the window because the sun's now getting so low that at this time it's got half my face will be in the sun and half will be in there, like what's happened in my last video. But it's been a really beautiful season. So anyway, that's 6 minutes of appreciation of nature, but I think that's worthwhile. What I wanted to talk about a little bit more now was I just wanted to be a little bit more formal with transcendental argumentation, because I was talking about the concept of proof, and I sort of went into deductive proofs, inductive proofs, abductive proofs, pragmatic proofs, just that sort of like that concept of proof, and then talk quite a lot in general terms about transcendental arguments and the importance of transcendental arguments, because it's still, I was just looking at I was just doing like a little bit of pre-reading before, just to remind myself of some things before I made this video, and I just noticed how some sources today just ignore transcendental arguments in their entirety. And I suppose that's because it's more difficult, because you're not dealing with individual facts of nature when you're making an argument like you are with an inductive or a deductive or an abductive, and even perhaps you're not a pragmatic sort of argument. You can make individual arguments about an individual fact, and so the scope of the argument is very narrow, and it's like you get the result straight away. Whereas with a transcendental argument, you're dealing with concepts, and your result of that argument is concept. It's not, you don't use a transcendental argument to get the answer about some specific factual question or something you're posing, like is it raining? No, well, what happened? You're going to the easiest way to answer the question, is it raining, is you're going to use an empirical method, and you get the result straight away. Whereas with a transcendental argument, you're dealing with a principle, and your result of your argument is a principle. And that's quite a different way. You're dealing with types, what would be called the types, rather than dealing with what the type generates. So that was Russell's famous theory of types, where Russell and Whitehead resolved some of the paradoxes that seem to be in some certain types of arguments. They were dealing with the philosophy of mathematics, and they said that sometimes self-referential statements, which are statements which are like, which, as it says, seem to be referring to themselves, they have to be understood in like an iterative sense, which basically means that you're dealing with something at a higher level, and then you're gradually coming down a little bit lower. If you've ever done any programming, you understand this sort of like this concept of type, because you define a type, which is your object that you're going to do something with, and then what you do is you instantiate the type to actually create a real object, which is your programmatic unit for doing whatever. So you understand there's a difference between, if you like, a conceptual description of something and the real instantiation or the real object itself. And that's something that's important in transcendental arguments. So I just wanted to try and just be slightly more formal. I don't think it's going to be helpful. I'm not trying to give like a philosophy lecture here. I'm trying to talk about my own work, and you can study it in detail in the written work, and there's a lot on it on my website already, planetmcneil.org /blog. There's a lot of stuff already on there if you really want to dig into the details of this, and especially in the bibliography. You can dig into it as much as you want. What this is meant to do is it's meant to give you some sort of familiarity with the overall concepts, and then you might find, yeah, because I think lots of people might have had some exposure to, say, deduction, and then some exposure, and you would, particularly if you're dealing with scientific sort of models and hypothesizing and research, you would have exposure to the inductive and the abductive argument. I would actually say that modern science is especially what we learned, say, through high school and up through what we would call A level, which is like pre-college. And I would say, and especially when I was reviewing some what some psychology undergraduates were sort of like doing in the name of science. I for a short time shared a house with them. I went back to study again in 2006 as a mature student, and for the first year I actually managed to do it full time. And I was sharing a house for a period of time with undergraduate psychology students, which was an interesting experience. But what was passing off as science for them when they were doing their sort of like undergraduate projects, I was thinking to myself, this is this really what people are calling scientific? I was sort of like, because it seemed to me that the hypothesis was so just not thought through. They were weak, and there was no idea of the interdependence of variables and how you're isolating things from other variables. And I thought, is this really what's passing off as undergraduate science now? Yeah. So and sort of like the weakness of looking at. But I think the point I was making there really is that when you look at it, it's not. Modern science is often considered to be founded inductively, which is, if you can remember the previous video where we're talking about induction, where induction is attempting to move from particular instances to a general concept, to a general principle, something more general. You're moving from the particulars to the general, whereas deduction was moving from the general to the particulars. But the inductive, with induction, you're always looking for more instances to try and to strengthen your final conclusion. So, but where perhaps modern science is a little bit more, what would I say, when you get more into technology and technological things, then you're going to see much more pragmatism sort of like coming in, where you're just trying to solve problems. In many ways, technology is the application of science to particular problems. So you may well find more pragmatic elements coming in, but really modern science in its essence is very much more inductive and abductive. With abductive reasoning, you're trying to get to the best explanation from your data. So you're looking at evidence in the environment, and you're seeing something. Then you're coming up with a hypothesis. Well, this seems to be the best explanation as to why this happened. You see an example I read today, which is quite good. You walk into your kitchen, you see a half-eaten sandwich, and you think, oh, my teenage son must have been in a rush, only made had time to eat half a sandwich. So you're coming up with some sort of explanation. There's necessarily no logical certainty there, but you're just trying to explain the facts, if you like, that physical fact. You're trying to come up with some sort of explanation. So it's a weaker form of argument. Like, it's not logic. There's no logical necessity. We found, one of the points we made, wasn't it, was only with deductive arguments are you coming up with logical certainty. Other argument forms, to a greater or lesser degree, are going to be dealing with probabilities. Whereas the transcendental argument is dealing not so much with those individual facts, but it's trying to establish using Kant's definition, the preconditions for how it's possible to have any of those other argument forms. What are you assuming about nature? What are you assuming about objects to have knowledge at all? And so it's a rather different question, which is perhaps the reason why there's a lot of arguments about, lots of misunderstandings about transcendental arguments, because they're dealing with concepts rather than with resolving individual problems of nature. You wouldn't, I think I've already mentioned it, you wouldn't try and argue the question, is it raining, by a transcendental argument. It doesn't make sense to do that. But sometimes people do get confused because they think that, that you can rephrase certain problems that people may have presented, have written, say a question. You might want to say, you might want to construct an argument that says, if you try and rephrase what somebody describes as rhetorically rephrasing, there was one of the criticisms was, transcendental arguments can be rhetorically rephrased as inductive or deductive arguments, and that would be to misunderstand the nature of a transcendental argument. I think there's an instance of there's a very competent theologian, theological, what would you call it, philosophical theologian perhaps, apologetic by Professor Frame, Dr. John Frame, and I'm not sure what his position is now, but particularly I think he was somebody that at one time asserted that just transcendental arguments weren't distinctive, that they could just be understood and rephrased as inductive or deductive arguments. And he gave like an example. You can just, if say like intelligibility in the universe, then God, or say if God, then intelligible universe. And he said, which sounds a bit like Van Til's transcendental argument, which was, he said that and atheism assumes theism, and so he's just saying, you can just reorganize that statement in some way and represent it as a inductive, or in that case like an inductive or a deductive argument, or something that sounds syllogistic. A syllogism, when what we did before, just something where you're presenting an if-then sort of construction. You're starting with premises, you're trying to come to a conclusion. So, but the criticism of that is that you're misunderstanding the transcendental argument. You're not trying to answer that individual question. You're trying to come to some sort of concept. Out pops a concept, something that helps you understand the world, not answering an individual question. That's one way to deal with a lot of the criticism of transcendental arguments, is that if somebody's starting from, say, and they're using, say, an individual statement, or they're trying to answer a question that's a factual question about nature, you're trying to come to some sort of explanation of something in the world, and you're dealing with specifics, then you've probably misunderstood the role and the nature of what a transcendental argument is, because transcendental argument always deals with concepts. That's one of it's dealing with what makes possible those individual factual derivations, or those logical principles, or those pragmatic concerns. You can, when you see criticisms like that, you can often decode them and say, well, they've just misunderstood the nature of transcendental argument. And in the chapter of my book where I deal with specifically with the transcendental argument for God, I go through some of those criticisms. I think there's somebody called Michael Butler, who was a student of Greg Banson, who was considered the foremost expositor of Dr. Van Til, and Michael actually writes an excellent article it was in a book. I think the book's called what is it? I think I will look it up and I'll put it in the description to say. I think it's the Standard Bearer. I think it's Essays in Memory of Dr. Greg Banson, and he does an excellent presentation of overview of transcendental arguments and some of the controversies connected with transcendental arguments, which we'll talk about briefly. And he when he goes through the discussion of the criticisms of the transcendental argument for God, Van Til's argument, Van Til's specific type of transcendental argument, he which is what I actually used his description. I thought it was so good that I used his essay, in a sense, when I was going through those criticisms, as a basis for my own discussion. But most of the time that he came back to that point again and again and again and again is that the critics have misunderstood what a transcendental argument is trying to do. If the scope of the argument gets very narrow and what your question becomes very narrow, then you've misunderstood what the transcendental argument is trying to do. So, with that long preamble there, I've got like a series of headings here, and so I am going to talk just a little bit more sort of perhaps. I'm not saying formally, because I don't want it to be too formal, because you'll just get lost in the detail of it, and this is one thing you have to. I'm very much trying to hear in the talks to support what I've done elsewhere, or to support the reading that you can go on and do elsewhere. But I do think it is useful to go through to try and put a little bit more meat on the bones of transcendental arguments themselves. So perhaps one of the earliest examples of transcendental arguments that we see, and this perhaps encapsulates. It gives a little bit more of a concrete example of what an argument, of what's trying to be achieved by a transcendental mode of argument. It's actually Aristotle's, all the way back to Aristotle, where Aristotle was discussing logic, and he gives a transcendental argument for logic, saying that you can never discuss logic without assuming logic. So that's a remarkable sort of like insight there, because your whole, what it's trying to actually show you is that your whole conceptual scheme is predicated, which means based on the idea of logical relations between the different elements of your conceptual scheme. So you can't discuss logic without assuming logic. You can't discuss, say, the logic in language without assuming a specific logic in language. Do you see that? It's a bit like, I think it's a bit like, say, imagine somebody was trying to come up with an argument saying that breathing is unnecessary, but all the time they're going to be breathing. So no matter how sharp their argumentation, or how insightful what they're actually saying is, or how useful it might be digging into the individual elements of their argument, saying, are you really breathing? Are we just brains in a vat, and we just think we're breathing, that we're just connected up and we're just stimulated, we're just being stimulated. We're in some sort of simulation, and matrix wise, if you know what the matrix theory, we're just experiencing these sensations that are just being fed to us, and we think that this is happening, but it's not really. But all the time we would be breathing, one way or another, we're going to be breathing. And so for somebody to come up with an argument about whether or not you're breathing or not, so that would be more like a transcendental discussion, because you're actually saying, well, actually, no, sorry, you're not going to be able to even speak without breathing, because the whole understanding that the vocal sounds and making the sound is actually to do with compression waves being generated in your vocal cords, and if there's no air there, then you wouldn't be able to speak. It's like it will be silent. So it's a bit like if you've ever seen the experiment that I can remember when I was about 13 or 14. You're learning about sound, and the big bell jar, and there's a bell in the middle of the bell jar, and then you suck all the air out, and the sound disappears, because the sound is molecules of air, the gases in the air being knocked together, a compression wave, and that goes through the air, hits your eardrum, but when you're sucking the air out, that's gone, and it's silent. So I can remember looking and seeing that. It was amazing. I think, look at that. It was like the bell was ringing, but you couldn't hear it. And so that's a nice, I suppose, nice picture of what transcendental argument is sort of like trying to do. That's like what you would call a reductio ad absurdum, which is like Latin for reducing to absurdity. So the transcendental method, when transcendental arguments are employed, you're often approaching it from, say, the formal form is, say, assume X, everybody agrees what X is, and then demonstrate that X requires that something else, we could just use the letter Y. So you accept X, and what you're trying to prove by the transcendental argument is that this X, that everybody, including the person that's skeptical, accepts, you're going to demonstrate by your transcendental argument that logically requires Y. And so, so it's like an if and only if. You're saying that this X is presupposed or requires, or it's necessary, that it's assuming Y. And so that's what the general form of a transcendental argument is that you're interested in this Y. You're saying everybody agrees over this X, but you're going to show, often by a reductio ad absurdum type style of argument, that it presupposes this Y, which is what I think was my first. If I bring this to the front, I think that helps me to check that that's correct. Yeah. And perhaps another one of the most interesting things about. Let me just check my timing here. Yeah. Okay. So that's the first thing to get. I think I'll reiterate this, and then I'll stop it, because I've sort of like gone the half an hour there. I'll try and chop them up into half an hour segments. So what I wrote here was to formalise the argument of the previous two chapters. The general logical form of the transcendental argument is this: assume X. X is accepted by all participants in the argument, even a local skeptic. And the reason why I've used the word local there, because if you're a global skeptic, you might not be prepared to accept anything, in which case we haven't got a discussion to be had. You can't have an argument. That's the issue that's one of the things that transcendental argument wants to demonstrate. One of its most powerful aspects is that to somebody that wants to deny and say that there is no reason, there is no rhyme to the universe, then you'll have to say, well, you're actually being incoherent. We can't have a discussion with you. That's it. End of. There's nothing you do. You can't have a discussion with somebody that doesn't that wants to. You have to have some sort of at least some sort of common basis. And if somebody just wants to assert that whether nothing can be known, then your the transcendental argument with respect to that is, well, if you're saying that nothing can be known, you can't know that nothing can be known by your own argument, and therefore your argument is incoherent. And that's one of the most powerful expressions of the power of the transcendental argument, because it says to the skeptic, you have to assume what you are arguing against and saying is false. You have to assume that is true in order to generate your skeptical argument. So that's what's called the reductio ad absurdum. Is you're saying if you assume that you're correct, if we assume that you are right, so let's assume that you are right, nothing can be known. That's absurd. The consequences are that absurd, because your argument, nothing can be known, assumes that something can be known. Okay, so that's I think that's probably as clear as you can get it if you want to grasp what a transcendental argument is. Okay, so I'll have a short pause here and I'll come back